in the interview? Or
Yes, yeah, he read some in the interview. Okay.
now, will you want me to do that?
I might.
Okay.
You brought some.
I
of the
did bring
work.
some books.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah, we'll do that towards the end.
Okay.
Before we begin the interview, though, well, the first thing that we do is we want to tell, for anyone that might discover the footage years from now, who we are and where we are. I'll start, and then I'll gesture towards you, and then you just say your full name and where you live currently.
Okay.
Today is December 17th, 2009. We're in Little Rock, Arkansas, in the Albert Pike Memorial Temple. We're recording oral histories for the Porter Fund.
And I'm Joe McDougall. I live in Leawood, Kansas, which will not mean anything to anyone, but it's in the conglomerate of Kansas City.
First question is, what is your earliest memory?
Of poetry?
No, just in general.
Oh, you don't know how long back you're asking me to go. I think my first vivid memory is losing a sand bucket in the ocean in Florida when I was about 4. And I had a brand new sand bucket, and I was there with my parents and my beloved older cousins, and we were walking along the shore, in the sand, and I put my bucket down to let water come in, and it was gone. And that was probably my first lesson about the how things change. Maybe that's the reason I'm a poet. I never thought of it before. Could be. I learned that nothing stays the same.
Even at that young age?
Yeah.
Wow. Do you remember perhaps the first poem that you ever heard or read?
Well, my mother read to me all the time. She started when I was a baby. I was born right after the Depression had hit its worst, but there was still Depression effects in Arkansas. And my dad was a farmer, and although he became fairly successful, then they were struggling. And she decided that I should have a set of books which was called My Book House. It doesn't exist anymore. You have to get them through rare book dealers. So she read to me all the time, and I think that really soaked in my soul, the words, the cadence, and the rhythm of her voice. And so my first memory is that, and then I wrote my first poem when I was probably about, I'm thinking 10 or something like that. I showed it to my father, and he framed it, put it on his desk. Well, you know, all poets are full of ego, so there I was, hooked. I thought, well, if I can get that kind of attention writing poetry, I might just keep on. I've never gotten quite that kind of attention since then.
At least not that it was important as
right,
as
not that unconditional.
Yeah, the unconditional.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have a habit when I'm reading. I don't write a lot in the margins. I'll just underline a word, or I'll underline a sentence, and out to the side I'll write truth. And I've been doing it for years. I mean, through a lot of my books, and it's just truth, truth, truth. And it's just a general thing. Changes, I guess, from book to book to some extent. Poetry, to me, always, the best kind of poetry for me is that can express something that I felt but couldn't articulate.
Exactly.
And I was going to see if you could talk about some of the poems, some of the poets that inspired you down that kind of a path. And they could be just life coaches. They don't have to be necessarily poetry teachers,
right,
as much as they are people that kind of instilled that love for observation.
Well, I think poetry is it should be about belonging to you, the reader. It should be something that speaks to you. And I like to say that I'm not very interested in poems that I can't carry home in the palm of my hand, that I want to connect with, I have connected with, and I want to take them home. You know, there are so many ways of writing poetry, and if they're good poets, they're all wonderful to read. But the ones that appeal to me are clear and have images that I really relate to, and there's a passion there, and I really want to take it home. I think I learned a lot of that from early reading. I didn't go into the MFA program at Arkansas until I was in my 40s. So I had done a lot of reading before then. And I was very influenced by Ezra Pound, his images. I was influenced by Robert Frost, whom I resisted for a long time, because everyone in high school said you have to read Robert Frost. But then I came to understand why he was so important. The narrative, the simplicity of and yet the richness of the language. Shakespeare, of course. Miller Williams, who tells you the story and tells it plain, and yet it's mysterious. Emily Dickinson, who just never ceases to amaze me. When I can read and reread the best of her work. There's some of her work that really is not that exciting to me. But the best of her work, when she's talking about grief, I can hardly bear to read it for very long. There are contemporary poets that have influenced me, Yusuf Kumanyaku, Gerald Stern, whom I cannot write anything like, but his passion for the subject really inspires me. James Whitehead was a great influence. I don't know if you know Jim's work, but his titles are sometimes poems, and that was something I really liked. So today, those are the people that I can think of that I really learned a lot from.
You talk about the simplicity with richness. It's easy to appreciate, difficult to pull off.
Very difficult.
You talked about trimming the fat.
Yeah.
Finding the right word is important. Let's talk for a moment about how long your process of writing a poem. I've heard that people will write it. It should happen. You write a letter of importance, let it sit on the desk for a couple of days.
Mm-hmm.
Revisit it. There's probably a paragraph that doesn't belong.
Right.
Do you do that with your poems?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. We'll talk about that.
Well, I can't think of any poem I've ever written that was ready to go, or I thought it was ready to go to an editor, or even to my husband, who's my best critic, until I had really worked on it a long time. And polish. And syntax is really important to me, the way the words work together, and the right word, and the line breaks. That's because I write free verse. That's very important. And so it can take weeks, months, whatever it takes. And even now I go back to some of my books and think, I wish I could rewrite that line. But as someone has famously said, you never finish a poem, you just abandon it, because you could go on endlessly polishing it. But I think for me the test is I write it and get it the way I think it should be. And then I'll read it aloud to myself, and then I'll catch a lot of things that should be changed. And then I show it to 3 or 4 trusted people, and I listen to what they have to say. And it's interesting, people will not say exactly the same thing, but if they're good readers, they usually find the weak spot, and they find the same weak spot. And that was something I learned in the program at Arkansas. I would take a poem to 2 or 3 different teachers, and they would not say the same thing, but they would all find the weak spot in the poem. And generally, there's more than one. Conciseness is something I really believe in, so I do like to trim the fat out, and I like to not overwrite the endings. It's a tedious process, but I enjoy rewriting, because you discover something new. There's sometime a whole new poem will come out of the rewrite.
I was speaking with Greg Brownderville several weeks back, and something was very interesting to me, and I think I've heard it before, but I'd forgotten it, and I certainly hadn't had it told to me the way he did, which was the process of writing is very similar to the process of being born and then death. It's because he said he mourns at the end of it because there's such excitement with the initial idea, the labor of bringing it to reality, the thrill of completion, but then there's that having to restart it over again.
Yes.
You're mourning the loss of the work, and you're also in a way kind of dreading maybe the entire, that hard process again.
Well, and I always wonder if I can do it again, if I can write a poem again that I would be happy to send to an editor. There's always that doubt. I think every writer has that terrible doubt in the back of his or her mind. Is this the last thing that I will write that is worth sending to somebody? Because you never know when it may just go away. I hope that doesn't happen for a long time because it is my life, it is my sustenance. I love writing poetry. I love writing in general.
When do you remember the first time, maybe it's the where you sent the poem into your dad, and maybe that was, and he framed it. Do you remember when you thought, I just saw something beautiful, and I think I've recreated it in words. This is something I enjoy doing. Do you remember ever? Was it a gradual process of discovery in that regard?
Well, that's a really wonderful question. I think it probably may have been that moment with my dad. And then when I was in college, I wrote. And, well, actually, when I was in high school, I was not writing poetry, at least I wasn't showing it to my teachers, but I did write a lot in essays, and I received some praise. And I thought then that I could write, and I loved to write, and I would stay with it. I had wonderful teachers at Dewood High. It was a time when there were smaller classes. There was less for the teachers to do, and so they spent more time with each individual student. I was just lucky in every way to be born there, to be born to the parents that I had, to have, heaven forbid, a happy childhood, and to have the teachers I had. So I think I knew early that I would write. I didn't know to the extent that I would become involved, that it would become my life, but what could be better? There are things that could certainly make more money.
I think about that pretty often. But I enjoy the liberty of my life, and I enjoy the creativity so much that I'm willing to forgo it.
Sure.
Most times. My grandmother would like it if I just got a job at a bank and got married.
Well, she would feel more secure about you.
True. Maybe
She wouldn't have to call you up at night.
That's what I was about to say. She can call me twice a day, or just once.
That's right.
We talked, you mentioned teachers.
Mm-hmm.
You talked about Miller. But to me, I think that money is important in schools. New technologies in the classroom is important. But we always talk about reforming education. To me, the best teacher that I ever had was the one who made me the most curious about my surroundings. He just continually expanded my mind and made me feel comfortable in doing so, and not being afraid of asking a silly question. That permission to believe in yourself, to push yourself. There's no way to quantify what it does for the kids that come in contact with it.
Lucky the person who has a teacher like that.
Absolutely. Did you have a person like that in your life? And tell me about it.
Well, I had several. And I think the other thing, too, besides that, challenging you or opening the door for you, for your own curiosity, is the passion that the teacher brings to the subject. And this is what Jim Whitehead did in the MFA program at Arkansas. You could not hear Jim read a poem and think of anything else. You were right there in the poem with him because he was so involved. Here was this huge man, an ex-football player, a macho man who absolutely loved poetry. And that was an eye-opener to me. And so I caught the passion. I caught the mystery of it from Miller, who was one of the most articulate teachers I've ever known. who could explain a poem, explicate the poem, and yet never destroy the mystery and never try to destroy the mystery, and who himself was involved in it. And therefore, I learned that with a good poem, and this was helpful to me when I became a teacher, with a good poem, you can't destroy it by explaining it because it resists all of your efforts to break it down. Now, for students, you have to start with nuts and bolts. And explication is wonderful because you show them line by line what the poet is doing or what you think the poet was doing. But in the end, that poem is going to be a thing of mystery and complexity, even if it's a very simple poem. So I learned that teaching poetry, you can't ruin a poem unless you don't like poetry. If you're not interested in poetry, you shouldn't be teaching it. So if you're passionate about your subject, you may make a lot of mistakes, but the students will come away with that idea that this is a subject worth knowing. This is why I think maybe long-distance learning could be a problem, because there's nothing like sitting in the classroom with that person, walking around, being in front, that you really can reach out and touch if you could, you know. I think that's important.
I think so too. One of the parallels that I've seen in the research that I've done is Philip and Jack's wanting to start the Porter Prize as a way to honor the legacy of Ben Kimple.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to, in the way that the prizes that they give out, and the type of author at the type of stage they're in their life,
Mm-hmm.
is very interesting to me too. And I think that parallels. In other words, Ben Kimple took people that were finding themselves, were almost there,
Yeah.
gave them permission to go the extra
Well,
step.
challenged you, made you, from what I understand.
And it was an exciting period. And I think in some ways, receiving the Porter Prize is an affirmation of the work you're doing.
Yes.
And it's also a challenge to continue.
Exactly.
And I was going to see if you could talk about the parallels between a good teacher and the Porter Prize in that respect.
Well, I can't say it any better than you've already said it, but I can say what the Porter Prize meant to me. I had been living in Kansas, and we had moved back to Arkansas, which is my native state, and then to be validated by Arkansas writers or people who had strong Arkansas connections was really very, very good for me. And you're right, then there was the challenge. I have to live up to their expectations. But validation is so important to writers, and especially poets who get very little recognition. Any kind of recognition that we get just makes you want to do more. It's a little success, no matter how small, that success breeds success. And that year was a very good year for me. I was able to place my poems in magazines I had been trying to get into. That was a good year. And the Porter Prize was a very big part of it. It came at the right time for me. I think you could win it too early, and I think you could win it too late. For me, it was right. I'm thankful for it.
Perfect answer. If you ran into someone in town today and they asked you what you were doing this afternoon, you said, I'm interviewing for the Porter Prize, and they said, what is the Porter Prize? What would you say?
Well, I would say that it's one of the most valuable prizes that Arkansas gives. It's given for poets at a certain stage of their career where they have done a reputable body of work, generally published, but they haven't yet won, say, the Prix de Rome or some of those really prestigious prizes like are given to poets who have advanced in their careers. And so it comes, it's meant to be a boost to an accomplished writer who hasn't yet achieved a lot of national recognition. And that's what I would tell them. But you know, most people understand now what the Porter Prize is. And I think that's thanks to Philip McMath, who has endlessly, tirelessly kept it going, he and his wife. Until now, it is, you don't have to, people, you can say the Porter Prize and they know what you mean, if they know anything at all about literature in Arkansas. And many, many people do. Thank goodness.
We could talk about Arkansas all day.
Well, and I think AETN has had a great deal to do with educating people.
It's a great place to work for.
Yeah.
Philip, talk to me for a moment about Philip McMath and this tireless effort for pushing the Porter Prize. Because I think that's an important story that he will never bring up.
He will never bring it up. He's too humble. But Philip, being a writer, knows what it means to have that validation. And he is an astounding man in terms of energy, and so is his wife, Carol. And they, along with Jack Butler, made it happen. And they looked around and said, there aren't any major prizes here, and we need something. And they wanted to honor Ben Kemple. And Ben Kemple, in characteristic humility, said, no, I don't want it named after me. Name it after my mother. You've heard that story. But were it not for Philip and Carol and Jack taking it through the rocky years when, from what I understand, Philip and Carol were making it happen in their own house, or looking for somebody's house to make it happen in, to have the celebration. So, and they've stayed with it. And so not only were they enthusiastic at the beginning, but Philip and Carol and Jack are still enthusiastic. And, well, we all are. It's a wonderful thing.
It's a wonderful club. I mean,
And we want to open it up every year to somebody else. So I hope it goes on forever.
Going back to your own personal story, do you have a favorite poem? And it's an impossible question sometimes, but do you have one that you favor? If you had to close your eyes and think about the first, I say poetry, you close your eyes, what's the first poem that comes to your mind?
Well, I love Shakespeare's Sonnet 73. That time of year, thou mayest in me behold, when the yellow leaves are none or few do hang upon those bare ruined choirs where late the sweet birds sang. I think that's fairly close to it. Those are the beginning lines. And I love that because the whole poem is about mutability, that nothing stays. And in the end, we will die, so we should enjoy life while we have it. But I like, when I was teaching every day, I like to use that poem because it illustrates wonderful syntax, the use of syntax, surprising. I think a poem, to be successful, must surprise the reader. And that was a surprising use, but a subtle use of syntax when yellow leaves are none or few do hang. Not a few, or some and a few and then none, but none or few. And that's one that I've always loved.
Surprising and solid, it firm, you know. Mm-hmm. It's surprising you couldn't see it coming, but you don't dismiss it for fluffiness, you know, it just.
Oh no, there's no fluff there.
Yeah,
it's all hard truth,
yeah.
But in such beautiful language and such unusual language.
You've talked a couple of times now about change, that nothing stays the same.
Mm-hmm.
That there's cycles,